In May of 1979, a woman died alone in a hotel suite in Los Angeles. She was 66 years old. Decades before, the newspapers of the world had called her the richest girl alive, and they had given her a nickname that followed her to the grave. The poor little rich girl. When she was 21, she came into a fortune worth, in today's money, more than $1 billion. And when she died, according to her own biographer, the money that remained came to $3,500, not $3.5 million. $3,500, about the price of a used car. Her name was Barbara Hutton, and the money, all of it, came from a name you already know, a name that sat in red and gold on the corner of Main Street in almost every town in America for most of a century. Woolworth, the five and dime, the store where your grandparents bought their first record, took home a goldfish in a paper cup, and split a grilled cheese at the lunch counter for pocket change. So how does the granddaughter of one of the richest men who ever lived end up with $3,500 to her name? This is the story of how an entire American fortune vanished and how almost nobody noticed until it was already gone. Here is the sheer scale of what was lost. The man who built this fortune, Barbara's grandfather, once put up the tallest building in the world, 60 stories, rising over downtown Manhattan in pale stone. And when the bill came due, $13.5 million, he did something almost no one could do then or now. He paid for the whole thing in cash, no loan, no mortgage, just a check. 3 generations later, that same family had nothing left to write a check with. The fortune did not collapse in a stock market panic. It was not seized by the government. It drained away, almost without a sound, through 3 specific mistakes that families with money still make today. And by the end of this story, you will know all 3. It was 1879, and a farm boy from upstate New York was failing at almost everything he tried. Frank Winfield Woolworth had grown up poor on a potato farm, so shy and so clumsy behind a store counter that his first bosses said outright that he had no talent for selling. And they had a point, but Frank had one strange idea. At the time, in most shops, you haggled over every price, and the goods sat locked behind a counter while a clerk fetched them for you. Frank wanted to flip both of those rules. What if everything in the store had one fixed price? 5 cents, no bargaining. And what if you let ordinary people walk in, pick the items up, hold them, and decide for themselves? He opened his first store on that idea in Utica, New York, and it failed within weeks. Bad location, he said. So he tried once more, this time in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On the very first day, he sold $127 worth of goods, and he wrote to his father that it was the most he had ever sold in a single day. That store did not fail. It became an empire. By 1912, Frank Woolworth had pulled 5 rival chains together into one company under his own name. 596 stores in a single stroke. Within a few years, there were more than 1,000 of them across the United States, Canada, and England. And then he built his monument. The Woolworth Building, finished in 1913, designed by the celebrated architect Cass Gilbert. At 792 feet, it was the tallest building on Earth, and it held that title for almost 20 years. A clergyman at the opening ceremony called it the Cathedral of Commerce. The farm boy nobody would hire now owned the tallest building in the world, and he had paid for every brick of it without borrowing a dime. But if you remember Woolworth at all, you may not remember the building. You remember the counter. Almost every Woolworth had one. A long lunch counter with chrome swivel stools right in the middle of the store. You could get a grilled cheese, a banana split, a cherry Coke hand mixed over crushed ice, all for the kind of change a kid could scrape together. For millions of Americans, that counter was the first restaurant they ever ate at without their parents. It was where you went after school, after church, after the Saturday matinee. By the 1960s, Woolworth was serving so many meals at those counters that its food business rivaled the early days of McDonald's. Think about that for a second. The humble five and dime was, with almost no one noticing, one of the largest restaurant operations in the country, and it happened by accident. That counter is the real reason this story still matters to so many people. Because the fortune that vanished was not built on oil or railroads or banks. It was built nickel by nickel by ordinary families, buying small things they could afford, at a store that felt like it belonged to the neighborhood. If you ever sat at one of those counters as a kid, you remember it better than anything you ever carried home in the bag. In 1919, Frank Woolworth died, and the way he died tells you almost everything about the man. He had a bad tooth, an infection took hold. And Frank Woolworth, who could have hired every dentist in New York, refused to go. He had carried a lifelong terror of dentists. The infection turned to blood poisoning, and at 66, the richest retailer in the world was brought down by a toothache he would not let anyone treat. Here's where the fortune took its first wrong turn, and this is the first of the three mistakes. Frank had drawn up plans for what should happen to his money after he was gone, but he died before he signed the updated will. So the entire fortune passed under an old will, written decades before, straight to his wife, Jennie. There was a serious problem. By that point, Jennie Woolworth had severe dementia. She had been declared, in the language of the day, incompetent to manage her own affairs. She could not run a fortune. The New York newspapers ran the headline in plain type: "Demented wife gets all." So the largest five and dime fortune in America landed in the lap of a woman who had no real idea she even held it, with no trust, no plan, and no structure of any kind to protect it. You would expect a fortune that size to arrive wrapped in an army of lawyers building walls around it. It arrived with almost nothing. And that single missing piece, a structure, is the thread that runs through this whole collapse. When Jennie Woolworth died in 1924, her estate was worth around $57 million, a staggering sum for the era, and it was divided among Frank Woolworth's three daughters, Helena, Jessie, and the middle daughter, Edna. Except Edna was already gone, and her death is one of the saddest chapters in this whole story. Edna Woolworth had married a stockbroker named Franklin Hutton, a co-founder of the brokerage firm E.F. Hutton. The marriage was miserable, and he was unfaithful in plain sight. In 1917, at the age of 33, Edna was found dead in a suite at the Plaza Hotel. The official cause was listed as an ear infection, but her biographer, C. David Heyman, concluded that Edna took her own life with poison and that the family arranged, behind closed doors, for the truth to stay out of the papers. The little girl who is said to have found her mother's body that day was 4 years old. Her name was Barbara. Because Edna had died before her own mother did, Edna's share of the Woolworth money passed straight down to that little girl. So Barbara inherited twice over, once from her grandmother and once from the mother she had lost. By the time the lawyers were finished, a grieving child stood to receive one of the largest inheritances in the country, while three separate branches of the family now managed their money apart, each on its own, with no shared plan and no one watching the whole. That is mistake number 2. A great fortune does not only need to be earned, it has to be held together. The Woolworth money was now splitting apart, and every funeral split it a little further. By the time Barbara Hutton turned 21, in 1933, her father had grown her inheritance to a reported $42 million. To feel what that means today, carry the number forward for inflation. $42 million in 1933 is worth more than $1 billion now. One young woman, just turned 21, handed more than $1 billion in today's money, with no job, no training, and nobody with real authority to ever tell her no. And the country she inherited it in was on its knees. This was the depths of the Great Depression. 1 in 4 Americans was out of work, families were losing their homes, bread lines stretched around the block, and 3 years before, for Barbara's grand debut into society, her family had thrown a party that cost $60,000, about $1 million in today's money, for a single party while the bread lines waited outside. That is the moment the press turned on her and the nickname stuck for life. The poor little rich girl. It was not sympathy. It was a sneer. Here is something worth sitting with. Everybody remembers the Woolworth lunch counter. So why does almost nobody remember that it built one of the great fortunes in American history, and that the heir to it was, at the very same time, perhaps the most envied and most miserable young woman alive? Because the money never made Barbara happy. It made her a target, and the people who came for it were charming, titled, and very, very patient. Over her life, Barbara Hutton married 7 times, and most of those marriages followed the same script. A man with a title and no money, a whirlwind courtship, a lavish wedding, and then a quiet, expensive exit. Her first husband was a Georgian prince named Alexis Madivani. On their wedding night, the story goes, he told her she was too fat and she fought an eating disorder for the rest of her life because of it. During the marriage, he ran through millions of her money on houses, polo ponies, and jewelry, and when it ended, he walked away far richer than he arrived. The pattern repeated, husband after husband, with one famous exception, and his name you will recognize, the actor Cary Grant. Grant was wealthy and famous in his own right, and when their marriage ended, he took nothing, not a single dollar. The press nicknamed them Cash and Cary, and he is remembered as the one husband who seemed to love her rather than her bank account. Then there was Porfirio Rubirosa, an international playboy. That marriage lasted 53 days. 53. And for those 53 days, Barbara handed him a reported $2.5 million, a string of polo ponies, a converted bomber aircraft, and a coffee plantation. That is the kind of number that makes accountants weep. A divorce settlement for a marriage that did not survive 2 months. Each marriage was another wound in the fortune, but the marriages alone did not empty $1 billion. To understand how the whole thing drained out, you have to do the math. So let us count it. Start with the inheritance, more than $1 billion in today's money, in the hands of one woman. Now begin pulling it apart. There were the divorce settlements, marriage after marriage, each carrying off millions. There was the spending, which is almost impossible to overstate, with accounts of her dropping close to $100,000 in a single day. Add the houses, the jewels, the staff, the hotel suites she lived in for years at a stretch. Add her genuine generosity, because she gave a great deal away, including a London mansion that is today the official residence of the United States ambassador. And then there is the part nobody ever warned her about: taxes. Across her lifetime, the tax on large American estates climbed from around a quarter of the total to as high as 70%, and every transfer along the Woolworth line was taken down by the government, with no structure in place to soften a single blow. Put it all together, decade after decade, and the arithmetic only ends one way. The richest girl in the world spent and was drained of more than $1 billion. When she died in 1979, her biographer, C. David Heyman, wrote that what remained came to $3,500. Some who were close to her disputed even that figure, but almost everyone agrees that, for all practical purposes, the fortune was gone. Now, you might be thinking this is a simple story. She was reckless, she was surrounded by gold diggers, she blew it, and all of that is true. But it misses the real lesson, and the real lesson is the third mistake. The deeper failure was never that Barbara Hutton spent the money. It is that no one ever built anything to protect the money from the person who inherited it. No structure, no guardrails. A traumatized 21-year-old was handed $1 billion and wished good luck. The fortune was never the problem. The missing wall around it was. And to see that, look at what happened to the company itself, because here the story takes a turn almost no one sees coming. You would assume the Woolworth company died too, and on the surface it looks that way. Through the 1960s, a new kind of rival arrived. Walmart, Kmart, and Target all opened their doors in the very same year, 1962. The five and dime looked old overnight. Woolworth tried to fight back with its own discount chain and lost. And then, in 1997, the company shut the last of its American Woolworth stores. After more than a century, the red and gold sign came down for good. But this is the part the story leaves out. The company did not die. It did something far stranger. Years before the variety stores closed, Woolworth had already bought a small shoe business, and in 1974 it used that business to launch a brand new kind of store, one that sold nothing but athletic sneakers. They called it Foot Locker. By the late 1990s, that sneaker business was the only part of the company still thriving. So the corporation made a decision almost without precedent. It walked away from its own name. In 1998, it became the Venator Group. And in 2001, it renamed itself, top to bottom, Foot Locker. So the next time you walk past a Foot Locker in the mall, understand what you are looking at. That is Woolworth. The same company, the same unbroken corporate bloodline, born in 1879, on a 5-cent idea, still alive today, just wearing referee stripes instead of red and gold. And if you are about to point out that there are still Woolworth stores in Australia, you are right. But that is a separate company that borrowed the name back in the 1920s. The American original became Foot Locker. Here is the irony that ties this whole story together. The company survived because it was willing to remake itself from the ground up. The family fortune died because no one ever transformed how it was held. So why does one fortune vanish in 3 generations while another lasts a century or more? It is not luck, and it is not even the size of the money. It is structure. And to see it, compare the Woolworths to another American dynasty from the very same era. The Rockefellers. When the Rockefeller fortune passed down, it was not handed out in lump sums to 21-year-olds. The family locked the core of its wealth inside trusts, one created in 1934 and another in 1952, run by professional trustees at a major bank. The money was pooled and protected so that no single heir could spend it down to nothing, and so that it would not fracture and shrink with every funeral. And the family went further. They ran their money like an institution out of a private office in Rockefeller Center that the family called Room 5600. A standing staff of accountants, lawyers, and investment managers ran the Rockefeller money as one continuous operation, generation after generation, for dozens and then hundreds of family members. No Rockefeller heir was ever handed a fortune like that at 21 and told good luck. Barbara Hutton was. That is the whole difference. In a single sentence, the Woolworths earned one of the great fortunes in American history. The 5 and dime, the lunch counter, the tallest building in the world, all of it real, all of it built from nickels and dimes handed across a wooden counter. But Frank Woolworth left that fortune the old-fashioned way, outright, undivided, unprotected. And by the time his granddaughter died in a hotel room in 1979, A woman once worth more than $1 billion in today's money had, by the count of her own biographer, $3,500 to her name. The difference was never how much money there was. It was whether anyone built something designed to outlive the person who made it. The Rockefellers built the wall. The Woolworths built the store. Here is what makes this land harder than a simple cautionary tale. Almost none of us will ever inherit $1 billion. But the lesson underneath it is the one thing that separates the families that keep wealth from the families that lose it, and it has nothing to do with how much they start with. It is whether anyone bothers to build a structure that protects the money from the people who come after. Frank Woolworth could fund the tallest building in the world in cash. He could not protect his own great-granddaughter from being handed too much, too young, with too little around it. The store on Main Street outlived the family that owned it. It just had to become a sneaker shop to do it. And the Woolworths are not the only American dynasty to learn this the hard way. There is another family that turned a fortune so large, it is almost hard to picture into very little in a single generation over beer. But that is a story for next time.